Hello, and welcome to a new episode of From the Honeycomb podcast. I am your host, Katerina. Each week, we dive into a blend of topics that resonate with the soul. Whether you're an architect enthusiast, have a passion for Wanderlust, want to discover holistic approaches to rejuvenate your body and mind, or are intrigued to learn about Vastu Shastra with a modern approach, you've come to the right place. Join me as I sit down with inspiring, like-minded women from various walks of life. We will delve into their journeys to discuss the challenges and moments that define their paths. So sit back, relax, and let the spark of positive energy ignite your curiosity. Hi, it's me, Katerina. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to share with you something that can change the trajectory of your life. If you are ready to start your own architecture firm but are feeling overwhelmed by where to begin, I understand, because I felt the same way when I first embarked on my entrepreneurial journey. This is why I have created the ebook, The Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm. This comprehensive workbook contains everything I wish I had known before starting my own firm. From building a solid business plan to creating your brand, The Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm offers a step-by-step guide tailored to your timeline, whether you're launching your firm today, next month, or in a few years. Dive into essential topics like financial planning, organization strategies, and how to secure your first client, all in one convenient resource. That's right, you don't have to spend hours researching. I have done that for you so you can focus on building your business. And that's not all. With your purchase, you'll also receive an exclusive meditation for business owners, mindfulness tips, a crystal guide for support, and gratitude exercises to help you stay focused and positive throughout your journey. Turn your dream of having your own firm into a reality with the Mindful Blueprint for Launching Your Architecture Firm. Click on the link in the show notes to get your copy today. Now, let's dive into the episode. Today, I am joined by Audrey Lau to talk about the world of insurance for architects and engineers. Audrey works for Draftrs, an insurance company whose mission it is to make professional liability insurance easier and for everyone. Audrey, welcome to From the Honeycomb.
Hi, Katerina. Thank you.
And as you know, we begin every episode by sharing something that we are grateful for in the present moment. So, Audrey, what are you grateful for?
So I would have to say my family, always my family. They bring so much joy, my kids, my husband, my extended family. So that's definitely what I'm always grateful for, my family.
Oh, I love it. Oh, that's great. And it is family. It is. You have to be so grateful for your family. And especially, seems like the world is just like upside down right now. And just having your family and being grateful for them is so important.
Definitely.
Well, Audrey, can you share with us first how you got into the insurance business? Because that's, to me, is very interesting. Is like what has brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when I started, there weren't a lot of insurance or risk management schools. It wasn't something that they taught in school. And I think a lot of people in my vintage, I think we just fall into insurance. I graduated, I did my master's degree, and Zurich Financial Services was recruiting.
Mm.
There was a recruiting fair, and I went to their booth and they're like, "We've got this program. You'll be training in Switzerland, and then you'll go to London, and then you'll do a couple of months in New York, and it'll be great." And I think that kind of sold me. I was like, wow, that sounds really exciting. So I joined that program, and it really was one of the best decisions that I've ever made. I mean, it was a fantastic experience to have a year-long training program that would support you in that way and allow you to travel. But then obviously, I really made a career in insurance out of it. So it was one of the better decisions in my life, definitely.
Wow, that's amazing. What an opportunity to be able to work in Switzerland and London and New York.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of the insurance carriers, they used to have programs like this, like year-long
Mm.
training programs for graduates. And, they've really cut back on those. Like that program, I don't think Zurich runs that program anymore. They ran it for about
Mm.
5 years and they're like, wow, it's really expensive. So we're not going to do it anymore. I think a lot of carriers are actually cutting back on those types of programs, unfortunately.
Interesting. Well, and then can you share with us? So, how we connected is through AWA plus D. So, I'll give them a little plug right now. So, at the end of every month, I attend a small business club Zoom call. It's like a coffee date with a bunch of other small business owners. And you were a guest during one of those Zoom calls to talk about insurance. And that conversation was like the way you described insurance was just so digestible and understandable because as an architect, like I can talk about design and building structures, but when it comes to like the admin, and now I've had my company for a little over a year, it's still like the world of insurances is just so foreign to me, but you have such a beautiful way of explaining it and making it understandable to architects.
Thank you. That's a high compliment. Thank you. I think it's largely just because, I've been doing this for over 15 years. I was an underwriter for over 15 years and specifically for architects and engineers, right? So I've been doing professional liability for architects, engineers, contractors, and property owners and in real estate. So it's my focus for the last 15 years. So I think it's a subject that I understand pretty well and I'm comfortable with. So it's easy for me to talk about.
Well, then good, because I've got some questions so listeners can understand more about insurance. So we have general liability and professional liability. And I know in the state of California, architects have to have general liability and automobile insurance if they're architects, but not professional. But can you share with us the difference between general liability and professional liability?
It's interesting. So I didn't realize that. I didn't know that architects needed to carry general liability and auto
Mhm.
insurance. Very bizarre, I think. I think those are actually probably, the people who make the requirements, the insurance department, they're not specialists either, right? They make generic rules for businesses. And it seems like that is a requirement that's more akin to contractors than design professionals.
Mhm.
In a nutshell, the difference between general liability and professional liability: general liability covers slips and falls on your premises. So if somebody comes to your office and falls down and gets injured, they sue you. That's what the general liability is for. So it's very similar to your homeowner's insurance. Like if, your dog bit somebody on the sidewalk or somebody trips on your sidewalk, then your liability insurance would cover that. So that's what general liability is for architects as well. So you imagine if you were a architect that worked from your home and you didn't have any office space, nobody's really coming to your house. From an actual risk perspective, there's very little exposure for you. And in fact, the only time that architects outside of California, I guess, get general liability when they're small firm architects, when they're freelancers, is probably if they're being required by contract from a landlord. So if you're renting office space and the landlord, a lot of times they'll have in their lease agreements a requirement for general liability because they don't want to be liable for it in case somebody comes to your office, falls down, and they don't want that person to end up suing them. So they want to make sure you carry that general liability insurance. So that's
Mhm.
general liability. Professional liability is actually what's most common for professionals. It's the main insurance coverage that professionals actually need. A lot of times when you're dealing with clients, that might be what's in the contract requirements. They might require you to carry professional liability. And the reason why they're requiring you to carry that is because professional liability covers you for your works and services. So in the event that you make a mistake or you just have an unsatisfied client, so a client is just unhappy with your work and they decide to come after you, that's what that professional liability policy is for. That covers you for your works and services, and the general liability covers you for slips and falls on your premises, essentially.
Mhm. Well, that's good. I carry both because obviously I'm in California, so general liability and then professional, the E&O, errors and emissions. I carried both. It's interesting you said that about landlords because I rent. Actually, it's a complex, so it's a company that owns multiple apartments. So that's actually interesting that that makes sense as well. Why you would need general liability because yes, I work from home. So, but thank you for describing the two differences. I guess you would see then more people getting the professional liability overall rather than getting general liability. Is that correct?
Yes. No, I think that's definitely accurate, especially if you're a professional, whether you're a design professional, you're a lawyer, you're a doctor. Most of the time, people are getting those types of professions. When you're providing a service to somebody, you're usually getting a professional liability policy to cover your works and services. So, who might get a general liability policy is, contractors. Contractors get that general
Mhm.
liability coverage, not just for premises, but there's also a second component that's offered to them: completed operations. So, in the event they build something and later on there's an issue with it, the general liability policy might respond to that. Also, if restaurants, retail stores, where you have people coming into your store all the time, those are the types of small businesses that might actually need a general liability policy.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. And then, do you by any chance do workman's comp as well?
We don't offer workers' comp. And so workers' comp, it's funny because workers' comp is probably, except in Texas, but in most states, it's required. Most small businesses are required to carry workers' comp. But there are certain rules. I'm not sure what the rules are in California, but sometimes they say if you only have one employee, then you don't need to cover it. You don't need to get the coverage. In Texas, you can waive out of it. You can just opt out of it and say, we're not carrying it. But workers' comp, we don't offer it. But it's probably the second line of coverage that a professional might need.
Yeah, I think in California, now that I think about it, because I don't have workman's comp, it's if you have an employee, so then you have to automatically, so that triggers a workman's comp. And then one of the questions I remember I asked during your coffee presentation was, and I'm gonna butcher out how I explain this right now, but I had a client ask me if they could, what is it called when they're under my policy?
They want to be added as an additional insured to your policy.
That's what it is. And
Yeah.
I spoke to other architects and they're like, we've never had a client ask that. So that was really interesting. And I remember that was one of the questions I asked. So is that common for architects and engineers?
It actually is common. It's actually quite common. And so a lot of times the reason why that requirement comes about is again, whether it's your client or the insurance department in your state, they're not specialists and professional.
Mm.
They don't really, so they have these requirements and they require them for everybody. But adding that owner to your policy is typically something you do on the general liability if you're a contractor. So then they're used to saying, okay, we're going to have that requirement for everybody and they're going to require it for the architects as well. So for architects, I think a lot of carriers for a while were unwilling to do it because if you added someone onto your professional policy, what it means is that you're covering them for their works and services. So if they were to then provide architecture work to another third party, they would potentially be covered under your professional liability policy for that. So that's why it's not something that's recommended. However, on our program and certain other carriers, they do offer an endorsement that is additional insured for what's called vicarious liability. So we're not covering the works and services of the owner. We're only covering them in the event that they get sued because of your works and services. So really
Mm.
get the benefit of defense under the policy. And that usually satisfies that contract requirement.
Got it. Is that where like indemnification comes into play?
So some people call it an additional insureds for vicarious endorsement. Some people call it an indemnification, like an owner's indemnification endorsement, which under that endorsement, they say they may or may not provide defense to the owner, but it does say that in the event the owner gets sued and is found liable because of your works and services, then the policy will directly indemnify them or the third party who is making the claim against them.
Mm. Thank you for explaining that again because when I was studying for my ARE, the architecture exams, indemnification and insurances were like the thing that I struggled with the most and understanding it. And I wish I had known you when I was studying for my architecture exams because these questions would come up and it's in my contract. I have an indemnification clause. And because I use the AIA documents, so they had that in there. And then as well as that's where my insurances are covered. And I know for the state of California, it has the requirements there. So that's where I understood what I needed for insurances. So thank you for explaining that because that indemnification and even just what it all means insurance wise and what you're covered for. And if something were to happen, especially during like the design process, but then thinking about construction, there's so much that goes into it that insurance covers.
Yeah. No, I didn't realize that they had those questions on licensing tests. But it's actually, I think a lot of architects, especially when you're starting up your own business, you're worried about getting clients, right? Getting
Mhm.
clients and doing a good job. And I think something like insurance kind of is not very fun. Like you said, you didn't know too much about it. So it's probably a little bit challenging, but it's actually very important. So one thing I will
Mhm.
say, it's great that you're using AIA standard contracts. It's always recommended to use standard contracts. But within those contracts, there's going to be contract provisions in there that you're signing with a client. And one of them are hold harmless and indemnification provisions. So you should have some understanding. Otherwise, you could potentially be signing up to liability that you didn't even know about or you didn't even intend to sign up for.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I stuck with AIA is because that's what I studied for the architecture exams. So I knew it, but I've also had clients who have questioned and then respectfully questioned, it's a contract. I get it. We're all signing legal documents, but who have questioned certain things about the contract. So as you mentioned, it's not fun as a business owner at first when you're like, yeah, I'm trying to get clients, but then it's also I have to pay for insurance. What insurance am I supposed to get? So I ended up talking to my mentor, who's also an architect, the similar scale projects as me, so I ended up talking with him and he gave me a recommendation, who to go with because that's also something is like as a business owner, you don't know there's so many insurance companies out there that you can end up using. And so can you tell us a little bit about, your company Drafters that you work for? Also, this is not sponsored in any way, but can you share how your company, how do you reach out to architects and get architects insured?
Yeah. So I actually started Drafters about 3 years ago. And it was after spending about 15 years underwriting at some of the large carriers. And I was actually largely doing large architects and engineers. So a lot of large firms in there. And I realized that small firms are vastly being neglected, right? A lot of times it's because, the firms are so small, the premiums are so small, the carriers really, the expenses are too high by the time you have to pay the agent and the underwriter to underwrite the account. So a lot of times the commercial insurance carriers, they decide not to offer insurance to small firms, unfortunately. When I say small firms, I mean the really small ones. I mean sole proprietors, probably people like you and your listeners. And so realizing that there was this huge, just black hole in the market, I started Drafters with the purpose of providing coverage for these small firms. And that's how I partnered with Markel Insurance Company. So we are actually an underwriting agent for them. And we only sell their policies. We underwrite the policies and issue the policies on their behalf. So now that we have this small niche focus on small firms, we do outreach. Like I did that coffee with the AWAD group. We're also affiliated with a couple of other associations. We're affiliated with AIBD, for example, which is largely a lot of small firms, residential designers. We haven't had too much luck with the larger organizations like AIA because I think, in many ways, the feedback that I hear a lot of is that, a lot of what they have, it doesn't necessarily cater to small firms. And so we haven't had a lot of luck partnering with them. But, mainly we do outreach to wherever small firms, what communities that you all are in. So, and we're always looking to partner with more people.
Amazing. And did you say you started Drafters?
Yes. So I started about 3 years ago with my partner, Curtis, who is actually he has a tech background. So he's the one
Mm.
who built the website and everything that we have behind it, that the quote, the policy administration, all of that stuff he built.
Wow, I didn't realize that. I mean, that, and I just asked you before we started. I'm like, do you still work for Drafters? Of course, it's your company. Can you walk us through? And I know this is also like just from an entrepreneurship standpoint, starting your own insurance company. What was that like? And when you made that transition, like, what was the transition you made into starting your own company?
Yeah. So I think, for me, I've worked at these really large, these big companies, like these corporate, really just, which is really not my personality. I can't believe I even lasted so long at those places.
Mm.
And then, it was around the pandemic too. And I'm like, I've always wanted to start my own business. I talked to a couple people, but I wanted to start a business. I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? Open a restaurant, a food truck? Like, what am
Mm.
I going to do? I wanted to utilize my skills somehow. And I started talking to some people and they were like, oh, you could do an MGA, you could start your own insurance. And I get very easily convinced and encouraged because everybody was so positive about it. So I'm like, all right, I'll go do that. I'll quit my job and I'll go do that. And in retrospect, it was actually very, very difficult. I think if you think it's difficult, like for architects, starting an insurance operation is because of the compliance that's required for it.
Mm.
It's very difficult. We need to go out and we need to find carriers to partner with. And then after I'm done getting a carrier, I have to get agents who sell the product for us. And then we have to go talk, get customers. So it's been quite challenging. I'll say, I think I might, if I were to go back in time 3 years ago, I might have done it a little bit differently. But I'm very proud of like what Curtis and I, what we've built in the last 3 years. I think it surprises a lot of people that we were able to build this and we didn't get any outside investment. We bootstrapped
Wow.
everything ourselves. So, I'm very proud of what we've accomplished, but it was difficult. It was a difficult journey.
Wow, that's amazing. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize. That's incredible. I mean, yeah, starting my own architecture firm, like that sounds a lot easier now because of what you said of the carriers. And then do you have to get like certification or licensure from all the different states? Because as we just talked, like you're in Texas, I'm in California. There's so many different variations among the states.
Yeah, so that's part of like the compliance part of it, right? So we're in 50 states, so we have to be licensed as an agent and as an agency in all 50 states. And then also the compliance, because we offer admitted products and they're regulated by each state regulator. So we have to follow the rules of each state. So, California might say, okay, well, you have to give your policyholders 30 days notice, and New York might be 45 days. So we have to build all of that type of compliance into our systems, so it's not just like with the company and the licensing, it's also with the product, insurance products itself. It gets a little bit complicated. And then I think one of the hardest parts about kind of the insurance structure that we have is really getting that underwriting authority from an insurance carrier, a carrier
Mhm.
who's saying to you, look, you're allowed to issue policies on our behalf. So that's kind of one of the trickier aspects, I think, for a lot of MGAs, just having an insurance carrier work with you. So we're very grateful as well for our carrier partners.
And you talked a lot about underwriters, and I remember that word from my architecture exams as well. But can you share with us what is an underwriter exactly and what do they do?
Those architecture exams they sound like something. I mean, do they they go into all these details? So an underwriter is basically a representative of the insurance company, and they're the
Mhm.
ones who assess your risk. So they look at your submission, your application, and they determine whether or not, you qualify for the program, and
Mm.
then they offer a price, the premium.
Okay, interesting, interesting. Yeah. Speaking of the exams, yeah, you don't learn any of this in architecture school. That's one thing the exams are good about when you get your licensures. There's one or two exams that specifically talk about what if it is to like run a firm. And there is like a section on insurances and underwriters and understanding that and indemnification. And you have to memorize contracts and understand. So it's a lot of which as an architect, the legal and insurance world is just those are the exams that I know a lot of architects can struggle with because it's just we're not used to that wording, especially and the wording especially because it's just sometimes you're reading something especially like legally and you're like what does that even mean. So going back to you starting your own company Drafters, Can you also share the name, like where that came from?
It was funny. My husband came up with the name and we were just joking around about some other idea that he had. I don't remember what idea it was, but it sounded like drafters, but he was like, oh, but then you guys are architects. So, originally, like we said, our tagline was like insurance for people who draft stuff, right? Because it wasn't just architects and interior designers. We also have products for consultants. We are looking to put out products for like lawyers. So they draft legal briefs. So that's kind of how I give my husband the credit. He came up
Hmm,
with it.
very well, really interesting. And another question I had too is, so why specifically have you focused on architects, interior designers, engineers? Like, where did that come from?
I think that was purely just my background, right? So it's
Mhm.
just from my work experience. It's the line of business that I'm most familiar with. It's also the one where I've noticed that there's a huge gap, like just small firms are not being served. So we don't offer any programs, we don't offer any policies for any firms that are over $1 million in revenues. And there's a
Mhm.
reason. The reason for that is because a lot of the other carriers are doing it. We didn't want that much competition. We wanted to be in another space. But the reason for that is because, most of the losses in the insurance market for professional liability architects and engineers, they're actually coming from large firms and middle market firms. They're
Mhm.
not coming from the small firms. The small firms actually, because the types of projects you all are working on tend to be smaller. They're like single family houses. The exposure is lower. So when you do get a claim, it's not as big as someone like AECOM who's working on some
Mhm.
airport, right? So what happened in the insurance industry is that most of these large firms are generating most of the losses, which has created rate increases all around for everybody. And a lot of these carriers, they don't differentiate. They're just kind of like, we do small firms, middle market firms, and large firms. And so a lot of times, the large firms, they get the benefit of having these brokers who negotiate on their behalf. They have buying power and they're able to negotiate really great rates for themselves. But it's small firms who end up almost subsidizing these large firms with the
Mhm.
insurance premiums. So just seeing that imbalance in the market, I thought that there could be a need for a program that's only focused on small firms so that we can deliver cheaper rates, premiums that are only targeted to small firms because we're no longer exposed to the large firm losses.
Interesting. No, that absolutely makes sense. And then how do you determine if someone is like a high risk and should have, it sounds like depending on how many projects they do, or I guess the money that comes in, would that be a high risk client? Because like someone like me, yeah, sole proprietor, I would love to make $1 million a year, but I'm definitely in that smaller percentile. But what does determine someone as like high risk?
Yeah, so I think it's generally, I think within the whole segment, we write engineers as well. We write construction managers, interior designers, land surveyors. And within that grouping, so it's anything that's construction design related. Within that grouping, probably the highest exposure in a book of business, what generates the most losses historically has been structural engineers and geotech engineers. So everything else is kind of run of the mill, right? So interior designers have very low exposure. So those are really great pluses to write. Architects actually have significant exposure because a lot of times you're the architect of record, your name is on the job. So architects do get claims as well. But how we determine it is really just historical performance, right? So Markel has their own experience with this class of business. They've been writing it for over 30 years. They actually recently pulled out of large firms. They don't do any architects and engineers except for the program that we underwrite for them. And then also from my experience at other carriers, all right? So the losses where I've seen the losses come in. And generally when we're talking about small firms making under $1 million, what you all are doing it's like maybe strip centers for commercial, it's single family homes, and that has very low exposure. And if somebody is building a high rise building that's 12 stories, they're probably not going to ask the sole proprietor to be the architect of record for a project like that. The architect of record might sub out some work to you, but as the main person who's responsible for those larger projects, it's unlikely to be a small firm sole proprietor. So it's just by virtue of that revenue size. We just assume that if you're making less than $1 million, then you're probably working on those smaller projects. And those smaller projects are things that we're comfortable with, except for if you're a structural engineer or a geotech engineer, because I think those guys, regardless of the project types, their losses tend to be more unfavorable.
That is very true. Most of the lawsuits I have heard of include a structural and geotechnical engineer. Absolutely. Especially now in California, we've been having a lot of rains and a lot of our coastline with the landslides. A lot of lawsuits have been coming up with geotechnical reports because of the landslides and some of the houses, parts of the houses have fallen. But not to get on tangent about that. So thankfully, so far, have had no issues or any lawsuits. But what happens with when you do go into a lawsuit? And how does that affect your insurance policy then?
Yeah. So a couple things, those professional liability policies, one of the main benefits I always tell people, it's not just, a lawsuit. It's not when a client says, hey, Katerina, you messed up. I'm going to sue you, right? You owe me $1 million and I'm going to sue you. That's not the only time that they respond. If a client were to send you an email that says, look, I think that there were these errors in this project, I think that there could be an issue here, that's something that you could potentially report to your carrier. And you can report that to your carrier as kind of a pre-claims matter, saying like, well, there's nothing here. They haven't demanded anything. And the carrier will investigate that for you. Now, on the other hand, if the client were to say, hey, you messed up and you owe me in an email, you messed up and you owe me $20,000. That's something you should report to your carrier as a potential
Mm.
claim. And once you report that to the carrier will handle it for you. They'll take that on, and if needed, they'll investigate it, and then they'll appoint a law firm to defend you and respond on your behalf. So that's really one of the main benefits of professional liability. I always tell people because I imagine if I were to be sued, my husband is actually a lawyer, so I know what I would do. And my in-laws are lawyers. But if you were to get sued, one of the biggest headaches is like, well, what do I do? How do I respond to this? How do I get a lawyer? Where do
Mm.
I find a lawyer? I think that's one of the biggest hassles. And then you pretty much have to like stop your business to handle this, to respond to this person who's potentially could be suing you, threatening to sue you for a lot of money. So one of the benefits of professional is that the carrier will give you a lot, they'll handle the defense for you so that you can get on and go on with your day and your job while they take on that lawsuit for you. So definitely, I mean, I think that's one of the main things that if you had an issue or claim, you would report that to your carrier and they would be able to take care of that for you.
So anybody listening, have professional liability insurance.
It's also like a very personal decision. I understand, some people you're like, oh, I'm starting up my business. I don't know if I can afford it. I don't want to spend money on it. If no clients are requiring it, I can kind of take a risk on that. It's a very personal decision too, especially if you're like, oh, well, I'm not doing much. I'm just an interior designer. So nobody's going
Mhm.
to sue me. And if they do sue me, I'm not going to owe them much. So it's a very personal decision. But I will say that the one thing that I do want to bring up is that, especially in the construction industry, it's extremely litigious, right? So it could be that maybe you didn't do anything wrong, you did everything perfectly, but the contractor messed up or one of the
Mhm.
other design consultants messed up, and then the owner brings in everybody into that claim. I think that's something that I hear that's quite common with a lot of small firms. A lot of our insureds say, like, well, I didn't have anything to do, I didn't have anything to do with it. And they just brought, but what ends up happening is that you still have to respond to that, right? You still have, and it'll cost you money to get a lawyer to respond on your behalf. So I think the only thing that I would caution everyone is that, you don't have to get, especially if it's not required, you don't have to get professional. But, right now, especially like a program like ours, it's really not that expensive. And it'll give you a lot of peace of mind in the event that you do get sued. Somebody can handle that lawsuit for you.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And then does your rate change at all? Obviously, I would assume it would, right? If you end up having to file a claim?
Yes, total, definitely. So professional liability policies are typically rated on your revenue. So it's based on revenue, which is kind of a proxy for exposure, like how much work you're doing. And then that kind of means like what's the likelihood of you getting a claim. The more work you do, the more likely it is. So it's rated on revenue, but then also claims experience. So most people don't have claims, but there are people who do have claims. And if you do have a claim, then like our program, for example, if you've had more than two claims or there've been more than, I think, $15,000 paid out on any prior policy, then you don't qualify for our program. So definitely if you have claims, that does affect the premium on your policy.
Mhm. That was gonna be one of my next questions. Is there like a maximum within a certain time? Or can you, like, let's say you have a claim and then for 10 years you don't have another claim and then you get a second claim. Is there like a time that also can be associated to it?
Yes. So there is a time. There's like 10 years is usually people probably, a lot of carriers on their applications, they'll ask for 5 years. We ask for 5 years, but some carriers might ask for 10 years. I think that's more focused on large firms, middle market and larger firms, but carriers will have like a 5 year or 10-year window. So if they're asking, have you had a claim in the last 5 years and you had one like 7 years ago, then you can answer no to that question and you won't be penalized for that.
Oh, good. Well, that's interesting to know. That's good to know as well. Well, Audrey, this has been really informative. I feel like I got a little refresher on insurances. And again, like I said, you explain everything so it's easy to digest for some, like for architects, and just because it is the insurance world is just this big unknown to us. Because where else would we learn it? I learned a little bit on the exams. So thank you so much for explaining everything so well. And just, yeah, it all makes so much sense, even more now.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And where can listeners find you?
So everyone can just go to the website. It's HTTPS. Nobody does WW anymore with the forward slashes, and it's Drafters. It's Draftrs without the E. So it's drafters.com without the E. And, I encourage everyone, if you're a small firm, come through the site, check it out. Just, you can get a quote, see how much it costs. If you currently have coverage, you can do a comparison. If you don't have coverage, you can see how much it costs. And you might be surprised because I think 5, 10 years ago, it was very expensive. A lot of carriers were like, it starts at $5,000. But that's not the case anymore, right? So our program is pretty competitive. So I would encourage your listeners to definitely go to our site, get a quote, and then you can reach me through there. If you have a question, I love helping people with questions. So if you have a question or anything, you can go to the contact us page, send me a question, and I'm happy to help you with that.
Oh, thank you so much, Audrey.
Thanks, Katerina.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From the Honeycomb podcast. As we conclude, I want to express my gratitude for joining me in today's episode. I hope you have found it insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and click that like button so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share this with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram at From the Honeycomb Podcast, and you can also further your support of From the Honeycomb by visiting the Patreon link provided in the show notes. Your contribution helps make more episodes possible. And lastly, don't forget to subscribe to my monthly newsletter, A Spark of Positive Energy, that comes out on the 7th of each month. Thank you so much, and see you next Friday.